I'm Pablo, and you are watching the 161 Report, coming to you live from Bamboo Strategic Media. The 161 Group has been putting on networking events in Gainesville for the past 3 years. Due to the coronavirus, we're not able to host in-person events currently. As any good entrepreneur would, we've adapted as quickly and as efficiently as we could, and we're very excited to present to you the 161 Report, a platform bringing you virtual events, exposure to local businesses and startups, and guest speakers to help you weather the storm during this tough time. We're very excited to present our guest speaker today, Martin Schaffel. He started his company in 1979, and he built it, AVISPL, he built it from zero to over 2,000 employees before selling in 2008. Marty went through some very tough times and had 2 near-death experiences for his company in the 80s. Today he's going to talk about how he got out of those situations and what you can do today to protect your business. Thank you for tuning in, and Marty, thank you so much for being here.
It's good to be here, Pablo. Thank you.
So Marty, why don't you start by telling our audience, we have a lot of people here who they've heard about you, they know about some of the things you've done, but they don't know your story. So why don't you give a brief synopsis of how you started your company and how you got to where you are today?
Well, I found that I didn't make a good employee. I got fired from most jobs I ever had, so I knew I needed to start a company. And I saw a product in 1979 called a Croy lettering machine. This was before PCs and other computer-aided devices, and it produced black letters on a piece of Scotch tape-like material, which would then be able to be peeled away from a backing and applied to an engineering drawing or anything that you would then take to a copier and reproduce, because the tape would disappear and all you would see is the black letters. And there was no other way back then to create large black letters for that type of application. So I called the manufacturer, told them I wanted to start a company selling their product, and they, at the time I only had $2,000 to my name, a $400 a month apartment, a beat up paid for station wagon, and a dog. And from there, I decided that I was going to start this company. As Bob Dylan says in the song Like a Rolling Stone, I love those lyrics. He says, when you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose. So that's about where I was back then. So I called the company and said I wanted to become a dealer of theirs to resell these devices. And they said, well, do you have $10,000 for the opening order, which would include 10 machines and necessary supplies and accessories? And I said, no, I was kind of hoping you would give me credit. And they said, no, that won't happen. So I eventually convinced them to send them to me under what existed then but doesn't now, called COD, cash on delivery, where the UPS driver would deliver them to my apartment and I would hand him a check, and that check would find its way through their system back to the company. They would then deposit it in the bank, and 8 days later they would eventually have my money in their account, which gave me a few days to receive the machines and go out and show them to some customers and see if I could pick up 10 checks, because I needed to sell. I gave myself 48 hours to get all the machines sold. I successfully did it. I made $4,000 worth of profit in those 2 days. Now I had $6,000 to my name and ordered 10 more machines, gave the check to the UPS driver, got the machines sold, got the money in the bank before my check ever cleared, and that's how I got started. Nowadays, you can't do that. It's not a proper thing to do, and you don't have that much time for your check to clear. So it was just something that existed back then that doesn't exist now. But anyway, I started buying more and more of these machines, and they started giving me credit, and the company started growing so fast that I didn't have enough cash to support the sales. So there was a woman who was in the credit department there that would extend me additional credit because she knew that even though I didn't have enough money to pay all my bills as fast as I needed to, she knew that anytime I ever made her a commitment or a promise, I kept it. So she eventually allowed me an extra $100,000 worth of credit, which was slow in being paid, but it enabled me to be able to have a working capital that I wouldn't have had otherwise, and that was how I started growing the business. Well, then one day the company got sold to some people in private equity, and the private equity guys came in and said, we don't approve of this arrangement anymore, and you have 48 hours to pay us the $100,000 you're past due, or we will cut you off from receiving any more product. And that happened at their headquarters out in Scottsdale, Arizona. Went back to my hotel room after the meeting and collapsed on the floor and started hyperventilating because it was a total anxiety attack. Never had one before, never had one afterwards, but the panic was pretty severe. I just thought it was all over. I thought I was going to lose the company, have to fire all the employees, and it was going to be over. But somehow I was able to find a few people to loan me enough money to be able to get the money to them. And by having that money in the bank then agreed to loan me money because I was able to show collateral. It was just a moment in time where the money I borrowed for some friends was in the bank. The bank saw the money was in the bank, and banks like to loan money to people who have who don't need it, who have money in the bank. So I ended up being able to borrow money from the bank, paid everybody else back, and got the manufacturer paid off. But I thought it was all over. It was a very, very scary moment. And
now, Marty,
that was the first lesson I about how critical it is not to rely on a single supplier for product.
So how did you adapt after learning that hard lesson? What were some of the changes that you implemented and made in your organization so that wouldn't happen to you again?
Well, I decided that I would spread our company across numerous different kinds of products and manufacturers so that no one manufacturer had such a big role in my business that anything they did on a whim could sink my ship or put me in a very bad position. So that was where I learned that you just can't have one single supplier. And later in life, I found you can't have a large single customer because you're also at great risk if they decide to go somewhere else. So first lessons learned in that year: don't rely on a single supplier, don't rely on a single customer.
Great. So now moving forward a little bit later in the 80s, you said that things were a little bit smooth sailing until 1987. Can you talk a little bit about your experience of what happened when the stock market crashed and how that affected your company?
The stock market crashed almost as proportionate to what we've experienced over the last week or two with this coronavirus issue. A huge drop in the stock market created panic. Although businesses weren't closed like we have right now, businesses stopped doing business until they could sort out where we were at as a country financially with this huge drop in the stock market. The stock market had like a 10% drop that day, which just sent panic everywhere. So what happened was, as a result of that, everybody stopped paying their bills. But I didn't really appreciate the idea that in a moment of crisis, conserving your cash is the most important thing you can do. So I kept on paying all my employees, and I paid every bill that I had where I owed people money. The problem was nobody was paying my bills, the ones that I sent out. So as a result, I ran out of cash in about a week. And now I had a real crisis on my hands because I couldn't make a payroll. And obviously I didn't have money for anything because I paid it out without realizing that people weren't going to pay me until they got a lot more comfortable with what was happening in the economy. And that created a crisis. We were profitable every year except for that year in the history of the company. And that particular year, we actually lost enough money during that crisis to where we had a negative book value. The value of the company was a minus $300,000, and I was fairly certain we weren't going to make it. But once again, through a few different maneuvers, all legal, renegotiating my lease with the landlord, where they suspended our rent payments, and rather than giving us a certain number of free months rent that comes with a new lease, they actually gave me a cash payment that helped my cash flow during that. So by negotiating a few different things here and there, I was able to squirm out of that situation. But it was a huge lesson learned with regards to, during a crisis, how critical it is to conserve cash. So fast forward to 9/11/2001, when the airplanes hit the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon. Everybody went into a crisis mode. The first thing I did is get up from my desk. I went to our accounting department and I said, not a single penny will go out the door except to make payroll for our employees. And as a result, we got through that 3 to 4 weeks of the whole country shutting down without a hiccup. Now, when you look at what's going on right now during this coronavirus crisis, until this stimulus package kicks in that Congress has approved today, people are going to have cash shortages as well, and it's going to be a considerable problem.
So, given those lessons that you learned, and real quick for our viewers tuning in now, you are watching the 161 Report. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you to Bamboo Strategic Media for making this possible. So Marty, with these lessons that you learned, what would you say business owners today, there's a lot of people watching this right now who are wondering, what can they do to weather the storm? They don't know how long this is going to last. They don't know, it's really affecting their business tremendously. What can they do if they didn't have those lessons ahead of time like you did? What can they do today?
Well, rule number one, don't spend a single penny more than you absolutely have to spend. You must conserve cash. There is no way around that. Number two, you need to be able to figure out how you can keep your employees. And I've heard some very interesting strategies, although the government's also trying to help bail out businesses to keep people employed with their companies, which we've never had before. So that may take several weeks to go into effect. But there's some different strategies that may be considered. Rather than laying off half your employees, you may, I know one person went to all their employees and said, we have a choice here. I can lay off half the employees and you may or may not be one of them, or we can all agree to take a 50% pay cut and we all have a job and we'll stick together and we'll get through this, and when we get to the other side, we will restore things the way they were. And that way, everybody can contribute to keeping it going. And of course, to the extent that the ownership doesn't have to take a paycheck, that's a strong statement. I know during our times of crisis, I never took a paycheck.
Now, there are a lot of business owners that, unfortunately, events or event planning, or for example, restaurants, their stream of revenue comes from one place and they only have one stream. And it's solely dependent on in-person, in-store traffic, or events happening. What advice do you have for some of these people who are having to make some very tough decisions right now and not sure what to do about their businesses?
Well, it's really important that you determine whether you have another avenue to create a stream of revenue to get through it. For instance, there's a number of restaurants that have figured out how to um, minimize their staff to just kitchen help and takeout business. And the takeout business during this crisis is helping the population, and it's also keeping a number of restaurants alive. Now, it's nowhere near as much revenue as they were getting from all the in restaurant dining, but it is a possible way to keep some sustenance of revenue so that you can get through the problem for as long as there's a market for takeout food. If you get down to a point where they shut down everything to a point where even takeout business ceases, then it's a different problem. But for now, if I were a restaurant, I would try and figure out, well, how can I get people to pay me to provide food to them, and how can I get it to them? Or do I want to have them order and then I'll have it ready and they come in and take it and leave? And I've seen a number of restaurants do that in order to get through this crisis.
Right. Okay, so for our viewers right now, we'll be taking some questions at the end, so make sure you send your questions in through the stream, and we'll be able to ask Marty those in the last 20 minutes, 10 minutes of the presentation. So Marty, going back to those times where you were having these near bankruptcy experiences, how were you able to keep yourself sane, and what were some things that you did that helped make the experience less horrible, or less anxious and less crazy for you?
We have everybody has different quirks with regards to what causes them to be energized. And for me, one of the things that causes me to be energized is problem solving. And the worse the problem, the more energized I am to try and come up with a solution. So while I certainly had my fears about the possible bad outcomes that could take place in any situation, I actually thrived in trying to figure out how to navigate through tough situations. And the more of them that I went through, the more confident I got in the decision-making process. But I think a lot of entrepreneurs really enjoy trying to figure out how to solve problems and take a group of people or a company through difficult situations.
What are some of the key characteristic traits that you believe you had that helped you navigate these situations?
I learned early on how critical it was to, facing a crisis, immediately confront what's the worst that can happen, and then get my arms around it and almost daydream my way through what's the worst that can happen. Fear sets in when you have this unknown and you're afraid of the unknown, and you panic as a result of it. So for me, what I tried to do was say, okay, what's the worst that can happen? Imagine it happening, imagining how I would deal with it. And then once I took myself through that whole process, I was no longer as afraid as I was before. So after that, I found that I could concentrate on what's the best that can happen, because I've already lived and digested what's the worst that can happen. So I'm not afraid of it anymore. Now I can spend all my time focusing on the best that can happen and how to make it happen.
Now, a lot of very successful entrepreneurs say that in times of crisis, there's a lot of opportunity. And some of the most successful tech companies today actually came out of the 2008 housing crisis and the recession. What opportunities do you see today because of the coronavirus?
Well, I would say that there is going to be obviously devastation in the businesses that are affected by air transport, cruise transport, hospitality, restaurants, bars, and so on. They're all going to get hammered during this period of time. On the other hand, people who are supporting the healthcare marketplace and come up with solutions for some of the shortcomings and shortfalls in necessary items and products for the healthcare crisis have a moment in time to where they are able to solve problems, meet needs, and end up having a successful venture. And then they have to reinvent themselves again when the crisis is over. But whenever there's a crisis, there are opportunities created and there is devastation taking place. And you have to steer yourself away from the devastation and say, okay, how can I reinvent myself during this crisis in a way to where I can get through it and I'll be better off for it? I know some distilleries are pumping out hand sanitizer right now because they have the alcohol, they have the ability to do it, and there's such a shortage of hand sanitizer in the market. They're making more per ounce from hand sanitizer than they are from vodka or tequila.
Absolutely, that's a great point, Marty. So I wanted to ask you, I know that you've got your own experiences where there was challenges in the marketplace, maybe other players in your industry struggling, and that was your time to pounce. That was your time to take advantage of the opportunity. Can you share a story of when you saw maybe a little bit of craziness in the marketplace and how you were able to capitalize on that opportunity to grow AVI SPL when you were running it?
Well, there was a period of time back in the 90s when a few guys got together and decided that they were going to use some venture capital money and try and buy a whole bunch of companies in our industry and put them all together and take it public. And they bought about 26 companies. They came to me and I wouldn't sell to them, but and I held out right to the end. I refused to sell to them. They did go public, but there were some issues with the filings and financial statements they reported. If I remember correctly, they overstated their inventory and did some other things that may not have been appropriate. As a result, they started to get in trouble with the SEC, and the company was looked like it was about to crumble. I called all our management team in and I said, guys and girls, I said, we need to go home, pack our suitcases, and we need to be prepared to fan out to different cities around the country where they had bought these companies. And we need to get a hotel room, each of us in a different city, and then call into the general manager of that particular office that they had and invite them to lunch or dinner and explain to them that it should be as clear to them as it is to you that their company is crumbling and we're not interested in buying the company or we're not interested in buying the office, but you're invited to come join our company and bring along the brightest and best with you, and we'll set up an office down the street and you'll be with the biggest company in the industry that is healthy rather than the biggest company in the industry which is going down the tubes. I think we had about $50 to $70 million worth of revenue at the time, and as a result of that maneuver, we picked up another $70 million worth of revenue that year with that particular move into the marketplace at that time.
Wow, that's incredible, Marty. Talk a little bit about how you had to reinvent yourself to keep up with so much growth in the company. That's a huge growth in just 1 year. That's amazing.
Well, there's a lot of reinvention that has to go on in a company. The company has to reinvent itself from a standpoint of what is its reason for existing every day. And as the company grows or changes, the leadership has to reinvent itself in the way that it leads. And salespeople and other people in the company, as things change, they have to change and reinvent themselves as well. So during the 35, 40 years that I was involved with the company, it was, I I had to reinvent myself as a leader many times. When I was the first employee, I bought the products, sold the products, fixed the products, sent out the bills, collected the money, deposited the money. Essentially, I did everything. When I realized that I should be paying people to do things that I can't do as efficiently so that I can spend more time selling and doing things I did much better, I ended up with a bunch of employees. So now I realize that my job description changed. Instead of being somebody selling products and services to customers, I was still selling, but I was selling a different product to a different set of customers. I was selling to my employees a vision of opportunity and success. That was my new reinvention of my role. And as the company continued to get bigger, I had to continue to reinvent myself as a leader and what the reporting structure was and so on. So the company also had to reinvent itself as the technology changed. I started with one product. Over time, we phased ourselves away from that and got involved in traditional audio-visual equipment in the early 80s, and then video equipment started to hit the marketplace, so we became a leader in selling video equipment for corporate and educational applications, recording equipment, editing equipment, and so on. And then in 1988, a gentleman came walking in the door. By then we were in an office warehouse space north of the airport in Tampa, and a guy came walking in the office with an original Apple PC, a plastic picture frame with a piece of glass in the middle, and it was about 10 or 12 inches in diameter and diagonal length of the piece of glass inside this picture frame, and a cable hanging out of it. And he asked if we had a traditional old-fashioned overhead projector. He wanted to show me something. So I went and got one, put it in the conference room. He took this plastic picture frame with this glass in the middle, put it on top of the overhead projector, plugged it into the Apple PC, and plugged everything in, turned it all on, turned on the overhead projector, and the light from the overhead projector went through the glass, which when you looked at it, you could see that there was text on the glass. This was the first liquid crystal material that was put into a format for displaying an image. And that's the technology that is now behind all the flat screen TVs and projectors and everything else. So as soon as we turned everything on and I saw black and white text up on the wall that was coming from this piece of glass, which was coming from the computer, I then said, wow, that's the way the world's going to communicate in the future. Shifted the whole direction of our company toward display technology, integrating display technology into classrooms, boardrooms, conference rooms, stadiums, war rooms, every kind of environment where you would have display technology and eventually teleconferencing. And then after that, we became the biggest in the industry. And for the last 16 years, the company has been the biggest in the industry. And from that $2,000 that I started with in 1979, this year the company will do $1.35 billion in revenue with about 3,500 employees.
Wow, that's incredible. What a great story of reinvention, Marty. And by the way, for our listeners and viewers, you are tuning into the 161 Report, and this is brought to you by Bamboo Strategic Media. We're going to be taking questions here in about 10 minutes, so make sure you send your questions in and we'll look at them. But going back to the show, so Marty, you just gave a great story of reinvention. Can you talk about how some businesses are going to and how they can reinvent themselves after this coronavirus crisis that's devastating businesses all over the country?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, every crisis devastates some people, but also creates opportunities for others if they look and see what problems can they solve that have now been created by this, or what needs can they meet from what has now been created by this. One thing for sure, this country will never again not have the appropriate stockpile of respirators and masks and gloves and gowns and everything else needed for a pandemic event. So you can be assured the government's going to start stockpiling this stuff, and if you have the best mousetrap or the best pricing around that mousetrap and good salespeople, you'll be part of the solution, filling the reserves of hospitals as well as the military, as well as Federal Emergency Management Agency and Department of Health and Human Services and CDC and every other entity that is going to want to make sure that we don't have the kinds of shortages that are killing us right now, and that there be sufficient, by the millions, quantity of testing kits, and that they're refreshed on a timely basis so that when we do need them, they are not obsolete or outdated or expired. There's a good example of where there's going to be huge opportunity in healthcare. And I'm willing to bet that there are going to be other kinds of ways for hand sanitizer to be mounted or displayed or made available in far more locations, convenient locations, because people are going to want to wash their hands a lot more when this is over than they did before. So there's going to be another area, whether you're creating the hand sanitizer or you come up with the most creative bracket to hang it near a gas pump or in a restroom or near any kinds of doors or anything else that people open, close, touch, whatever.
Absolutely. So, Marty, there's a lot of people who right now are looking at the market and seeing where can I place my bets. A lot of people talk about how they make money in the down market and, the Big Short, which I'm sure you saw. Are you looking at any investments right now? And what would you say other people should be looking at?
Well, just like there's moments in time when opportunity strikes when it comes to a particular product or opportunity in business, they also exist in the financial market. Those people who decided that once the stimulus package was getting closer to being passed, the market would spike. So those who bought into the market when it was at 18 or 19,000, market's probably around 23,000 today, so they got a bump from that. But the question will be, when will they abandon that position? Because we still don't know, after this stimulus, this $2 trillion stimulus gets distributed, whether it was enough to overcome the underlying devastation to our economy and all the employees out of work and all the businesses that won't come back when this is over. So we don't really know how much, this is a silent killer in the economy. We don't know how much damage is being done to so many of the small businesses that supported the Olympics or the Masters or Major League Baseball or basketball or hockey or concerts like South by Southwest or the Kentucky Derby. There's 155,000 people go to the Kentucky Derby, and there's hundreds of millions of dollars worth of money flowing through Louisville during that event. South by Southwest, when that event was canceled, it cost the city of Austin $350 million. It'll cost Japan billions of dollars to have built out for the Olympics, and then Olympics are postponed. So there's a lot of devastation, and there will be the stock market may, I think, fall again when the stimulus money is gone and the crisis isn't. And this crisis is yet to peak, and this virus is yet to peak before it rescinds, it gives up its curve and flattens out. There was a situation I had over the last couple of days where a lot of money that I got from my company I put into fixed income kinds of things like municipal bonds. Well, the bond market got crushed when interest rates dropped. So uh, there just wasn't any money to be made in buying any new bonds. If you had bonds that were 4 or 5% tax free, then they were a good investment. But I had sold some of those off at a profit, waiting for a day when I could maybe come back in the market in a good spot. Well, it just turns out that toward the end of last week and the first couple of days of this week, people got so nervous in the marketplace that they started demanding their money from the funds that were holding municipal bonds. And they were demanding their money back, asking for redemptions on the money that they had in these funds. Well, the funds don't have cash sitting around, so they had to liquidate bonds and assets in order to give these people their money. Well, they were dumping these bonds at absurd prices because they had to comply and give people their money. So there was a 3 or 4 day window of time where instead of a 30-year municipal bond paying 1.5%, I was able to get some at 5%, which is a huge difference. And it was only lasted for a couple of days, and by today it all died down because the market started to rebound, therefore the bond market moved, and that window of time lasted 4 or 5 days. Was able to make some very, very attractive bond purchases from funds that were dumping them, and there was that moment. And if you're sitting there ready to pounce with cash and enthusiasm, you may be able to be rewarded.
Absolutely. That's some great insight, Marty. So now we're getting into the question and answer section of our show. So we're going to start to read off some of the questions that we have from our audience. The first question that we have from you, from one of our viewers, Marty, is what are your thoughts on the new stimulus package, and how do you feel it's going to affect small businesses?
Well, we don't know all the details yet, but $2 trillion is a lot of money. So there's got to be an efficient way to get that money out there. I'm involved with a nonprofit association that's also hoping to get money to keep employees paid and on payroll rather than have to lay them off. So that's going to be an advantage for this association to keep its employees, which is very important. There's going to be direct money to people who otherwise would be totally running out of cash. Way too many people in this country don't have enough cash to get past a day or two shortfall, a week at the most. So people are going to receive direct cash payments, and that will help them buy gas and buy food for some period of time. Whether it's 1 month or 2 months, we don't know. But at the moment, I think that the stimulus package will get people through 30 to 60 days. I don't know how long it's going to take for the government to be able to create a process for small businesses to get their hands on these grants, and for these funds to get in the hands of people who don't have cash. These are really tough, important questions, and government usually doesn't do these types of things efficiently. So we can only hope that this is that one exception where they actually can figure out how to do this efficiently.
Absolutely. So the next question that we have from our listeners is, Marty, they just heard your story, and one of our listeners is actually wondering, were you able to leverage debt when you were struggling, when you had tough times, to navigate those times?
Yeah, I use debt in different ways. I used debt when I had problems. I also used debt when I saw that I could make money on it. A good example is I had a manufacturer that would give me significant discounts on merchandise if I prepaid the order. And these were commodity items. These were computer projectors and video projectors. So I had this idea that I learned it in finance class, University of Florida, that if I could take a discount on an invoice by paying them before I got paid by my customers, and I borrowed the money to do it, I would be making money. So I had a manufacturer that was giving me anywhere from 5 to 7% discount if I paid them in 10 days, or I prepaid them, instead of in 30 days, which is when the money was usually due. And I knew that it would take me about 90 days to get the merchandise in, get the merchandise sold, and distribute and collect the checks and get the money in the bank. And so what I did was I borrowed money at what seemed like a very high rate, 12 to 15%. But the effective rate I was getting for the offer that they were making with this big discount on the invoice was the equivalent of 50 or 60%. So I was making 45% just by doing this maneuver every 90 days, and did very well by that. So that's where I used debt as an opportunity to make money, because what I was paying for the money wasn't anywhere near what I was getting by using the money. It's kind of like what I told the broker the other day with the big brokerage house when I was working on these bonds. I said, listen, if I have to borrow money at today's rate of 0.25%, but I can get a 5% municipal bond, I'm going to do that for as long and as hard as I can.
Absolutely. So for our viewers, just a reminder, you are listening to the 161 Report. We're in the Q&A section. One more question that I actually personally have for you, Marty. I know a lot of our listeners are currently struggling with this. We've got a lot of business owners that all of a sudden, within the span of a week, had to start working remotely, and everybody's working from home. And you were great with company culture in your company, and even when you had a business with over 2,000 employees, you were able to maintain that culture. What kind of advice and tips do you have for some of our audience, the business owners tuning in right now, on how to maintain that culture remotely?
I would say that the one principle that's really important right now is employees are scared, employees are nervous, employees are frightened, feel threatened. The business owner has their hands on the steering wheel and feels like they're driving. The employee feels helpless and scared. So it's very important to, number one, reassure employees, and number two, make it very clear that you're going to do anything and everything you can to keep that bond in place, that bond of loyalty, and that you're going to look out for them, and you're going to anticipate they're going to look out for you, and we're going to get through this together. That may not always work if you have to have layoffs, and that's when the culture becomes affected, because there's nothing more disruptive to the corporate culture than layoffs or irrational terminations.
Right. So the next question we have from one of our listeners is these temporary lifestyle changes that we currently have due to the coronavirus. How long do you think they'll last? Do you think there will be some permanent lifestyle changes? And if so, is there an opportunity to capitalize on some of those in some way?
Once again, people are going to find alternative ways to work, alternative ways to shake hands. There's going to be a lot of hand for a long time. People are scarred by this. They're going to use a lot more hand sanitizer than they did before. They're going to use gloves. for a lot of situations where they didn't before. They're going to do things that will be somewhat protective of their personal space and health for a long time. The habit's going to be formed as a result of what's going on now, and it's going to last for some period of time until we just go back to complacency. However, there are some scientists and medical professionals who are anticipating that this is going to come back again, and we're going to have to be ready for that.
Absolutely.
I'm going to add to the background.
Okay. So for our listeners, you are tuning in to the 161 Report. Thank you for being with us today. We're very excited about this, and Marty's our first guest speaker on this series. We'll have more coming out soon. We'll post it on this page, so make sure you like it. And thank you to our sponsor, Bamboo Strategic Media, for making this possible. So we're going to take about one or two more questions here, and then we're going to wrap up. But before we get to those, Marty, so a lot of people here are wondering, they've got small businesses and they're struggling to adapt. What are some steps that they can take to implement culture now when they're small, so that when they grow to a larger scale, they can still maintain that? What are some things that they can do when they're small, and what are some things that you did when it was just you and the company and a few others?
The leadership has to show that it's taking a greater sacrifice than the employees. I made it very clear that I either didn't take a paycheck or I took the last paycheck, and that everybody else got paid before me. I made it very clear that we're in this battle together. It's very interesting right now to listen to the daily press conference that Governor Cuomo of New York has. He demonstrates candidness, empathy, honesty, straightforwardness, and I think he causes the citizens of New York, even though they're the epicenter of crisis right now with this virus, a lot better reassurance and feeling than some of the other people holding press conferences.
Absolutely. So we're having a little trouble seeing the questions right now. Just 1 second. So Marty, do you think that the stimulus package will be enough for the small businesses over time?
I would say this first one is probably good for 60 to 90 days, and it'll get dispersed in a hurry. And if we haven't silenced this virus and gotten our arms around, who's after the earth is scorched by this, who's alive, what businesses are in place, and what can we do to, get more people whole again. We don't really know. We're not going to know for a while how bad the damage is to the economy. So there's a few moving parts here. The first moving part is we haven't been able to test enough people yet to know how widespread the virus is. And we don't really know where the peak is yet, although this virus is ramping up at an exponential rate. So the speed at which new cases are coming around and deaths are taking place is very scary. And we don't know when we're going to be going down the other side of the hill from this, the number of cases that are being reported. So that's the first challenge. So without knowing when we're finally starting to, see this thing simmer down, we can't really see where the end point is of people getting back to work and resuming a normal life, work life and economy. So my hunch is, personally, that we're a minimum of 90 days away from getting people back to normal working kids out of the house and small groups coming together. I still think the large group events are going to be a little bit slower to come into place because they can really set off a chain reaction of contagion if we don't have this thing in place. One of our challenges right now is half the country still hasn't really imposed restrictions to get people to stay inside and let this thing die out. So, and even in Mississippi, the governor of Mississippi announced that he was overriding the counties and cities that were clamping down on businesses and people being out and about and asking everybody to stay home. And the governor of Mississippi took an opposite approach and said, I'm overruling that and there won't be any shutdowns. Well, now if you have a whole state and you have 20 states or whatever that are, calling it business as usual every day, it's going to be a long time before we get this thing under control.
Right. So for our listeners, we've actually got one of our listeners, a few of our listeners have posted some resources below in the comments. So make sure you check those out for small business owners. And we're going to take our last question here. So Marty, shifting a little bit of the focus to real estate. The president has said we're putting evictions on hold. What do you say? What do you have to say, or any advice or tips, suggestions for people who are pretty into real estate and maybe they're, the majority of their income comes from properties that they rent out, and now some of their tenants are going to stop paying?
I was just talking to somebody about that today. I've got some investments in a number of apartment complexes, and they pay a quarterly return to the investors. All those payments have been put on hold as these funds are trying to hold on to their cash right now, anticipating that people aren't going to be paying rent and they're not going to be evicted. So it has some trickle-down effects, obviously, and that's why it's so important to get this virus under control, because the longer it hangs out there, the more months we're going to have of these rent abatements or mortgage payment abatements and so on. It's real, I guess in conclusion, my comments are, as individuals, we want to hold on to cash. As businesses, we want to hold on to cash. I went to go get some cash the other day from a bank, and they cut in half the amount of cash that they would dispense, because they're hoarding cash. They're holding on to cash. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thought. And then, quite frankly, if we don't get this thing under control, the longer we have to keep people out of work and at home, the more likely we are, and if we can't get cash in their hands to be able to feed themselves, the more likely we are to actually end up with some social unrest and possible rioting. So some bad things can happen down the road in our society, which I saw back in the 60s and 70s, if we don't take this seriously and get this under control.
Absolutely. So we're going to wrap up now, but first, before we finish the show, Marty, you were a very successful entrepreneur. You've accomplished so much, and a lot of our viewers are business owners, aspiring entrepreneurs, and if you could just leave them with some words of wisdom, or maybe some of the best advice that you've received, please do so now.
Well, make sure that your employees feel that you're in it with them, and that everybody's gonna come out the other side okay, and that you understand their problems, and you're going to do everything you can to keep everybody as healthy and as solvent as possible to get through this to the extent that you can. It's a lot harder to replace good employees if you lay them off at the beginning of this. So it's important to find ways to keep your talented people, even if you have to negotiate with them a company-wide reduction in payroll in order to keep everybody on the payroll. And make sure that it's very clear to them that you may be paying them, but you're not paying yourself until this is over, to the extent you can do that. And again, that they understand that you're rallying with them in this fight against this virus to take everybody to a better place.
Absolutely. Those were some great words, Marty. This is the 161 Report. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.